Wonderful. So thank you all for joining us. Welcome. This is SV at Home's July 2023 Policy in Action. And we're talking about the next 8 years, keeping housing elements promises. Good to see you today. Happy Friday. I'm Regina Celestin Williams. I'm the Executive Director of SV at Home. And I'm super excited to be talking about this policy, this policy in action today. Policy in Action at Home is a monthly informal discussion convening housers to engage on hot housing topics. Every month, we select a topic or a current event, and we bring in experts to give a brief presentation. And then we like to open it up a little bit to discussion. We want you all to ask questions, float new ideas, and identify potential areas for shared action. So before we begin, we will want to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Ohlone Muwekma, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamian Nation, and the Ama Mutsun, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the Indigenous people and nations that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and who are a part of our community. So with that, I have the pleasure of handing it over to Alison Cingolani, our policy manager, who will be moderating the discussion today. Alison?
Thank you so much, Regina. Corey, perfect. You got us right on the right slide. So we want to ensure that our conversations and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. So please be kind and courteous to each other. No rude comments or personal attacks. We do encourage asking questions and listening as we learn today and engage with each other. If you have questions as we're going through the presentation, we do expect this to be a fairly meaty one. Please drop those questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A section toward the end. But please do keep comments and questions focused on our topic today. Sometimes we do find the chat can get lively. If you find that it's distracting you from the content of the discussion, we do encourage you to consider closing the chat temporarily. So I'm so excited to introduce our guest today, who brings a tremendous amount of expertise and experience in the field. Jeff Levin is the Senior Director of Policy at East Bay Housing Organizations, known to many of you as EBHO. Jeff has nearly 40 years of experience in the field of affordable housing and community development. As EBHO's policy director, he works with member and allied organizations and individuals on regional land use and housing planning, equitable development, gentrification and displacement, state legislation, and local housing policies such as inclusionary zoning, impact fees, public land, and of course, housing elements. Before joining EBHO 10 years ago, Jeff spent over 28 years with the city of Oakland, where, among other things, he played a lead role in developing Oakland's third and fourth housing element cycles, and in preparing progress reports to the state. So I'm going to take a few minutes to set the table for us today with a brief overview of what the housing element is, why it's important, and how this housing element cycle presents a new and unique opportunity for housing advocates to get the real change that our communities need. So then I'll turn it over to Jeff to talk about how we as advocates can make sure we recognize the promise that housing elements hold, with some examples of different approaches that have been successful in the last housing element cycle, and how we're thinking about the work kind of looking forward over the next 8 years. For those of you who are super familiar with housing elements, bear with me a little bit, but we will be doing some reframing over the next couple of slides. So just a quick note, I'm going to use the term cities a lot because acknowledging we're also talking about towns and counties, just because it's a lot less of a mouthful than listing them all out each time. So what the housing element is right now in this moment is an 8-year housing work plan for each city. So we've been thinking about this as a process. We've been thinking about it as all the component pieces that go into creating the housing element. But as we stand now, as these housing elements are beginning to cross the finish line, they are a work plan for the city. That really glosses over the enormous amount of work that goes into creating them in the interest of time and keeping the focus on our collective work over the next 8 years. But I think it's an important switch. The core purpose of the housing element, which is required by state law, is for each city to meet the housing needs of all their residents at all income levels. Every 8 years, each city in the region gets a regional housing need allocation, known as the RHNA, the RHNA, which establishes how many homes affordable at each income level the city needs to plan spaces for and policies to facilitate. So cities are required to plan for this housing production to preserve the affordable homes people are already living in and to protect vulnerable tenants from displacement. Fair housing laws require cities to take meaningful action to address disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity, replace segregated living patterns with integrated and balanced living patterns, transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas, replace segregated living patterns with integrated and balanced living patterns, transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. You may recognize that language because cities have to actively take action. This requirement is known as Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH. I didn't come up with the name. New to this round, so cities now have to be proactive about addressing the impacts of housing discrimination rather than just recognizing discrimination. So there is a requirement to address disparate housing needs and conditions. If this is new to you, I recognize this is a lot to take in, but I want to reassure you that we will be sharing a lot of additional resources along with the recording of this event in a follow-up email to all attendees. So what's in there? What's in the housing element? Next slide, please. So engagement. Deliberately, cities are required to engage with the full community to learn about the unique housing needs and disparities in housing access among groups of people protected under fair housing law and the organizations that represent them. Analysis, so incorporating lived experience, community knowledge, and data to understand patterns. Programs. So the programs really are where we're going to focus today. These are strategies to address unique housing needs and patterns that are identified through the engagement and analysis with clear actions, timelines, and metrics. So programs are really where the bulk of the city staff's work plan lies now over the next 8 years. Then we also have sites. These are parcels of land that the city has identified, paired with policy tools to ensure that they can develop with the number of units and affordability the city has planned. So how has all this been working out? Next slide, please. In a word, not well. So the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, recently released cities' progress toward their housing goals through the end of 2022. So that's just 1 month short of the end of the 8-year cycle. What you see here is how Santa Clara County's large and mid-sized cities have done at building housing that's affordable, indicated by red, orange, and yellow bars, and for folks that are earning well above the county's median income, which is the blue bar. The black line across the graph is the target for the planning period. So you'll see that affordable housing production consistently trails the production of the higher cost market rate homes in almost every jurisdiction. We have collectively and dramatically failed to build the affordable housing that we need across the county, even by the pretty modest standards of the last round of the local RHNA commitments. While financing for the number of affordable homes that we need in Silicon Valley is incredibly challenging in our current environment, there are clear steps that cities can take to remove barriers and encourage production. So the way cities have been working to address housing needs have really been falling far short. That's kind of the takeaway of this section of this slide. In many ways, the new laws and requirements for the next cycle are intended to address this failure. Next slide, please. The 6th 8-year planning cycle, which began in the Bay Area on February 1st of this year, has the potential to be far more successful than the 5th cycle at generating the affordable homes we need, but its success depends on housing advocates staying engaged in their communities. Since the last planning cycle, California's legislators have passed housing forward legislation intended to help housing elements generate more affordable housing, address patterns of racial and economic segregation, and meet the unique housing needs of cities' residents at every income level. So what makes this planning cycle different? We have those much higher targets, especially for affordable homes. This is going to require changes, real changes in the way cities do things to accommodate, including significant rezoning, opening up new areas to affordable homes where affordable homes have not been located or multifamily housing has not been located in the past. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, I mentioned. Laws that help make sure that the plans, the programs that cities are creating really respond and acknowledge needs and have the potential to be effective and have clear timelines and metrics that cities are accountable to meeting. And there are consequences for cities that don't comply that include loss of access to funding, loss of local land use control, and fines and legal action. Next slide, please. So what makes this planning cycle different? Regional partners such as MTC and ABAG and state partners like HCD have done an enormous amount of work and will also be providing an infrastructure of support and technical assistance through the 8-year implementation period. The state has also been very clear about enforcement and the need for local advocates to be involved. We also have advocates who are prepared and empowered to act. So that's many of you. Many of you have worked hard to get critical programs into our housing elements, like programs that make the permitting process for affordable and permanent supportive housing faster and less expensive, programs that invest in improving infrastructure in historically disinvested neighborhoods, tenant protection programs, changes in zoning, and much, much more. In every city, staff right now are confronting the enormous amount of work that is now in their work plan, and they will need ongoing support and engagement from all of us to help make this real and not just a promise on paper. Particularly when you think about this as an 8-year planning cycle, there's going to be a lot of changes in staff turnover. There will be multiple election cycles, so we'll have different elected officials that are going to want to have input on this. So really hewing to this plan and making sure that the plan is working is going to be critical. In the meantime, we need these programs to be real because our communities are depending on it. So there are programs in the housing elements to create new policies that will happen without any engagement at all, like rezoning an area. So we need to kind of start to think about, what types of programs are in there and how do we need to engage with different types of programs. So the programs that happen without any engagement at all might not require so much attention from us. Then there are some programs that are study or explore that will come back to City Council for them to make decisions on how to proceed and what work to direct city staff to do. And there are programs to create policies, but with enough ambiguity in the program so that it could potentially be really impactful or not very impactful at all. Part of our work will be winnowing down those really impactful programs that need engagement and understanding how to get out ahead of staff's work and ensure that we're plugged into the shaping of the work. The key here is going to be linking ongoing advocacy efforts to goals, priorities, and actions in the housing element. So despite all the legal changes in the housing element framework, these are likely to kind of go back on the shelf if advocates don't engage with the policies that are really important to them. The work we've done to get our key policy priorities into the element is just the beginning. It's not going to happen unless we engage to make it happen, and that's going to take deliberate effort. So with that, we can stop screen sharing. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Levin for our next section. Thank you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Alison. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and fabulous turnout here. I see a lot of familiar faces, so this is great. And thanks for that great overview of the housing element process and framing this. So let me say there's a couple pieces we want to talk about here, both the need to continue to do analysis of how cities are actually implementing their housing element and how we can do effective advocacy to make sure that all the things we fought for in the housing element actually happen. So first, I just want to acknowledge all the folks who worked on the housing element this time around, because I think throughout the region, we saw a level of public involvement that certainly I haven't seen in past housing elements. I think some of that was due to the new requirements and especially the affirmatively furthering fair housing. And some of it is just a reflection of the depth of the housing crisis and how many more people are paying attention to it. But that meant there was a lot of activism and a lot of push to get some really effective policies into the housing elements. So let me say, getting those elements passed is just the first step, and we need to make sure that the cities carry out those plans and carry them out in the way that we intended when we were advocating for these policies. So the first thing I think is just, it's important for us to pay attention over the next 8 years as to how cities are actually implementing their programs. And I think we should think of the housing element as a contract between the city and the public, the residents of the community, and also a contract between the city and the State Department of Housing and Community Development. And HCD, who was responsible for reviewing and approving housing elements in the first place, has been fairly clear that that is how they are now looking at it. We'll come back to this later, but HCD has beefed up their enforcement. They have a housing accountability unit. It's clear that they were a lot more stringent with folks in the review of the housing elements, and we're hoping that that will continue as we move into the implementation phase. But we want the housing element to be understood not just as something that is aspirational and maybe we'll get to it, but this is a contract, and the city is committing to take certain actions. Certain parties will carry them out by certain dates with expected outcomes, and we want to be paying attention to that. So the first tool that we have to do that with is that every year, jurisdictions are required to file an annual progress report with the state, providing information both quantitatively and qualitatively on how they are performing at implementing their housing elements. And those are all due April 1st of each year. And there is also a requirement that there be a local public hearing. There is not necessarily a requirement that there be a public hearing prior to the submission of the annual progress report, but there is certainly a requirement that there be a public hearing, which provides a really good opportunity, if housing is not an issue that comes up frequently before the city council, to make sure that's in front of them, that they are reminded of what they committed to, and to really push them on effective implementation. So I'm going to put up on screen just quickly some ways to get some of the data. You can always get the annual progress report directly from the cities, but they're also posted on HCD's website. And I just want to walk through something there real quick. I'm going to drop a link into the chat, which is a direct link into this dashboard, but then I'm also going to show you just how to navigate to that. So let me share my screen here. Okay. And I have lost my ability to navigate. There we go. So if you land on HCD's main website, you can just go to Planning and Community Development and drop down to Housing Open Data Tools. And that will take you to a whole bunch of resources. A lot of stuff that's not related to the housing element, but really useful. But right here at the very top left is a link for the annual progress report, data dashboard, and downloads. And if we go into that, and I will say it's not immediately obvious how to work with this, but most important down here, if you scroll down enough, there are 16 different screens that you can go through, and I'm just going to land on a couple of them that I think are particularly important for us to pay attention to. So of course, there are some general instructions here on page 1 and some additional resources. The first screen that I think is relevant is on actually the second page, page 2, and this is the housing pipeline. I'm sorry, I jumped too many pages. I'm getting a bad lag here, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, so the housing development pipeline is showing for the year that was reported, and you can select years up here. You can narrow stuff down, and I'll show you that in a minute. But you can see how many applications for land use approval have been submitted, what has actually been approved or entitled, what has had building permits issued and what has been completed. So you can actually see what's going on through the whole pipeline. But for purposes of jurisdictions being able to say that they did or did not achieve their RHNA goals, that's the regional housing needs allocation, what HCD is really looking at is building permit issuances compared to what the goals were in the RHNA. So this is for the whole state. You can narrow this down. So we can go in and select a particular county. Why don't we jump in and we'll select Santa Clara County here. And then you can filter it further by jurisdiction. And we'll jump into San Jose. So this is San Jose's report now for 2022. And you can see what's going on in terms of what's been in, and it is broken down by income level, which is really important. So we can see very low income, moderate, and above moderate, and how all of that is moving through. And again, as I said, looking at this permitted part is really important. And we can see what they're doing and what the mix is, and not much of a surprise here really, but we see this in most jurisdictions, this tremendous imbalance between what's being produced at the above moderate level and what's being produced in the affordable level. We'll come back to this. Paying attention to that ratio is a really useful advocacy tool when you're pushing for implementation of new programs. So these statistics can be really important when we get into advocacy on this. Just quickly, if you needed to see it on page 9, you can see the actual RHNA allocations. And again, you'll be able to select through for multiple jurisdictions. There we go. But this breaks out, and it's got the same ability to filter. I'm not going to go through all that now, but you can filter by region and drill down into localities and see what the RHNAs were. And you can look at both the 5th cycle, which is the period which for the Bay Area just ended in 2022, and 6th cycle, which is the new housing elements that we just did our advocacy on. So if you're trying to see what are the targets that folks are looking for, and you haven't quite found that in the housing element itself, it's here in the dashboard. And then the particular data page that I find especially useful is on page 11. And that's because this is actually looking at permits issued compared to the RHNA for a particular cycle. And again, we can drill down quickly. San Jose, and get a better picture of what's going on. And because we're right now looking at 6th cycle, it's blank because there's been no reporting because we're in year 1 and the reporting won't happen until next year. But we can switch back to, it's dropped in. I won't go back and select the temp, but you can select 5th cycle, see the numbers here. And this is really useful to see what percentage of the RHNA folks have had and how far through we are. Again, this is really helpful. I know we have used this in a number of places to show that, the city is at 110% of its RHNA for above mod, but 20% for very low, to stress the importance of focusing on policies that really zoom in on where the housing need is and where it's not being met. And in the case of some of EBHO's advocacy, to really caution against providing too much incentive to market rate housing without focusing on getting some affordable housing as part of the package, because it's just incentivizing things that the market is already doing and failing to focus on things that the market is not providing, where we really need the cities to step in and really redouble their efforts. So I just wanted to give you a look at this. The very last page I wanted to show, which is particularly helpful if you don't get hold of the full report, is on page 15, is the narratives on each and every program in the housing element. And I'm just going to work with the city that comes up, but you can select your jurisdiction over here. As I said, it goes through every program that was put into the Housing Elements Action Program, picks up the objective from there, and then this is what the city is reporting on the status and the time frame. So, you know, the city said we're going to study inclusionary zoning. Well, where are they at in that process? Have they started the study? Have they selected a consultant? It's a way to make sure that they are staying on track, or find out if they're not staying on track. But this is really the details. You know, some cities had scores or, you know, 100 different programs. You can go through here and find out what's going on and identify for the programs you're most interested in, where is the city at? So if you haven't been able to follow that on an ongoing basis, this is a great chance to check in on this here and really use this to push the cities to do some more. So I just really wanted to point out that that tool is available to people and encourage you to use it. Having said that, there are a lot of policies in the housing element. So how do you choose which ones to focus? I think, you know, I would advise you not to try and follow each and every program and track all of them. It's more than you're going to be able to do. And if you are active in more than one city, you'll find it completely overwhelming to try and do that. And a lot of the programs that are in the housing element are really just continuation of the same programs that cities do on an ongoing basis. And while it's nice to know what's going on there, for us, what's been particularly important is the new programs that we pushed to get into the housing element to see if they're being implemented. And often the cities didn't say, we're going to adopt an inclusionary ordinance and it's going to require 15% of units to be affordable for low income. You're rarely going to get that level of detail about a new program, much as we would like to see the housing element be the place that new programs are actually adopted. That's usually not how it works. And instead, what we will see is statements by the city that they will commit, they will study, they will consider, they will review. And in the past, that was about as far as they went in the housing element. You know, in the next 8 years, the city will review an inclusionary zoning ordinance, and nothing happened. I've seen cities where the same "we will review" has come up cycle after cycle with nothing happening. HCD was a little stricter this time in terms of what was in there, and they were calling out cities that they could not simply say they would review. There needed to be some really concrete outcome. And we pushed repeatedly that the commitment be, we're going to review this policy, we're going to do it in this time frame, we're going to bring concrete recommendations to the legislative body. So the housing element might not have been able to say, we absolutely will pass this policy, but it did say, and we want to continue to push on this, we'll make sure that that policy comes before the legislative body, the city council, the board of supervisors, to make sure that there is a real consideration of adopting this policy, and not just, we do this report, we put it on a shelf, and it never sees the light of day. You want to pay attention to that. HCD required that there be deadlines in there. So if they said, we will bring this before council by mid-2024, you want to make sure that happens, and you want to call them out for not doing it, because that means they are not in compliance with their housing element, which can have some serious connotations. So as I say, looking at the timing and the progress, that is important. For us, we have focused on particular policies and particular jurisdictions where there has been a lot of activism already, and where we have allies that we can work with to push on this. In Oakland, we're working on things like public land policy and trying to go beyond the Surplus Land Act to look at how the city is going to dispose of public land and really prioritize it for affordable housing. And we want to make sure that that is moving forward. The city is actually overdue, and we'll actually say there were some issues with what they put in the housing element, and we're working now to get the city to come back and revisit that. In some places, we have seen push for TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase, or its corollary, Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. So TOPA and COPA, we were successful in some cities in getting a commitment to at least bring a proposal forward on TOPA COPA, which would give tenants the opportunity to purchase their buildings in and prevent the loss of those buildings as affordable housing and prevent the displacement of people in them. We will be following up on that. Some places are talking about either adopting, if they don't have it, or revisiting the requirements for inclusionary zoning or for their housing impact fees. Tenant protection measures is another thing that we pushed in a number of places with some fairly vague language. You know, we weren't successful in getting places to say we will adopt rent control, but we were successful in getting them to say we will bring a package of potential tenant protection measures before the city council by such and such date. And you want to make sure that they are on track and doing that. And the last thing I wanted to mention is to look at the sites themselves. We put a lot of effort into the sites that were in the housing element, the site inventory of sites suitable for development of housing at all economic levels. But we want to now come back and see what's actually happening on those sites. Are they getting developed, and are they getting developed for what the city said they were going to be developed in the housing element? When you go through that site inventory, it will say this site, you know, has a realistic capacity of 100 units. We expect these to be 100% lower income. So you want to come back and find out, was there any kind of entitlement application on that site? Were building permits issued, and what's going to be built there? And I would suggest that you pay particular attention to situations where fewer units are being built on the site than was called for in the housing element, or where the income mix was supposed to be lower income, but in fact, a market rate developer has acquired that site and is developing on it. And the reason for this is that there is a provision in state law called no net loss, which is the cities have to maintain for the entire period of the housing element the capacity to meet their RHNA. And if they start underdeveloping sites for fewer units than were called for, or they develop them at the wrong income level, they may not have enough sites left in their inventory to cover the unmet RHNA need. You want to pay attention to that, because you have a hook in the law. If they are going to end up with a net loss of site capacity that prevents them from meeting their RHNA, they're actually not able to issue approvals for sites in the inventory if it puts them below that capacity without identifying replacement sites so that they maintain that capacity. And that's known as the no net loss rule. So it's really helpful to pay attention to what's actually happening to all those sites. And that leads us into another issue. Alison had talked about affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, and one of the components of that was to really try and open up areas that have traditionally been exclusionary and have seen little housing development at all, or have seen only market rate development and no affordable development. So in addition to seeing the extent to which your jurisdiction is meeting its numbers overall, where is it meeting its numbers? Is housing being built in the places where the city said it was going to be built? Are they opening up new areas and developing affordable housing? And you want to look at that. You also want to look at some of the other programs that cities identified that they would carry out for affirmatively furthering housing. If they were going to, well, one in particular was on sites, I want to focus on this one, is there's two components to affirmatively furthering fair housing with respect to sites. There is opportunity and mobility, providing the opportunity for people to move into high resource, high opportunity areas by building affordable housing in places that really haven't seen very much of it. And the other part is to stabilize existing low income and disadvantaged communities, particularly those that are under the threat of either disinvestment or gentrification and displacement. And HCD cautioned jurisdictions and called them out in their review letters that where cities have continued to identify most of their sites in these low resource, low income areas, that was not enough. If the city was going to claim that they were affirmatively furthering fair housing by investing in affordable housing in low income neighborhoods, HCD said, you need to show us that that is linked to place-based strategies for community development. And I think it's really important to situate whatever they're doing on, great, we did 4 housing projects in this neighborhood. What else is going on in that neighborhood? Are they investing in the infrastructure? Are transit improvements being done? Are there, public amenities? And are those being done in a way that will benefit the existing residents, or are those being done in a way that's more likely to attract new higher income residents? Because if they're not carrying that out correctly, I think we can call them out for not meeting their obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. So I think it's really important to take a good look at that. As we move through this implementation, public participation is really important, and they may or may not have called out any particular public participation process when they drafted the housing element. But for all of these things where they said, we will study, we will review, we will consider, we always push that be an open process. We don't want the cities to hire a consultant, go off in a corner and come back with a fully finished report. We want them to open up that process from the beginning, identify what the needs are, what the community's desires and preferences are. And for some of the wonkier folks here, on some of these studies, the assumptions and the methodology that they use in an inclusionary zoning study or an impact fee study to determine what the feasible level is, it matters a lot. And so we want them to open that up and provide the opportunity to comment not just on the results of the study, but the design and scope of the study itself. So I really encourage people to go back in the housing element, identify those key policies where the city said, we will study, we will review, and make sure that you can get in and do advocacy around that from the very beginning. Use the housing element as a hook for advocacy. So every time we come forward advocating for particular policies, it's really helpful to say, and your housing element says in policy 3.4 that you are going to do this, and remind the city council that they committed to doing certain things and that you're going to hold them accountable. Keep the housing element alive in these discussions as a living document and not just a plan that's sitting up on the shelf. It I think is really a helpful way to go. Develop relationships with staff and elected officials in your community, particularly those that are sympathetic to affordable housing. Find out from the staff where they are at on particular programs. If you have allies on your city council or your board of supervisors, check in with them periodically and let them know what you think is happening or not happening with the housing element. Often they can make inquiries or press issues in a way that's more effective than just you showing up and speaking at open forum or on a particular council item. Those relationships are really important, and we have found over time, as we keep talking to elected officials about the housing element, that it really sinks into them that this is an important document and it really is a contract, and this is a way to hold people accountable for carrying out those plans. And the last thing I just want to mention is, cities are really not doing this. We do have the resort that HCD is enforcing housing elements, and we saw that they did a much better job in reviewing the housing elements themselves as they were being prepared. They wrote extensive review letters telling cities where they had fallen short and what they were going to have to do in order to come into compliance. We encourage people to do the same thing with the annual progress reports. If the city is not doing what it said it was going to do, and that's clear, or they're not providing enough information in the annual progress reports, we don't know yet to what extent HCD is going to follow up on these issues, but I think where there are major concerns with the city's not actually carrying out their housing element, to follow up with HCD, in particular in their housing accountability unit, to keep them in the loop that we do not see the city is performing, because they can take action to enforce. They can decertify a city's housing element if they're really far out of compliance, and that has a lot of consequences for cities. That's not something they're going to want to do. So, I don't think you can go running to HCD every time there's a small delay in implementing a policy. But if you see major cases where a city says, yeah, we changed our mind, we're not going to do that, I think apart from any local advocacy, consulting with HCD to see what kind of enforcement they can do would also be important. So I want to stop there. I want to make sure that we have time for questions and discussions. I'm sure there's a lot out there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's awesome. And there is such an enormous amount of information in the HCD APR dashboard. It's really fun to just kind of go digging through that and see what you can learn about your city and where it is and how it's progressing. So we talked a little bit about programs and how each chunk of the city's work, each policy that they're working on, each plan that they're addressing is going to wind up in its own program. And in some cities, there's more than 100 of these. And clearly, we can't, as advocates, track all of those. And if we spread ourselves too thin, we risk being ineffective on the things that matter most. So we can see that looking forward over the next 8 years, we'll really need to focus in on the handful of programs in the elements that we feel like are really going to make a difference in our communities and start thinking about the best way to approach them. So, there's some programs that may or may not make a big difference in the change in the community. There are some that are going to have really clear parameters like rezoning, where did this happen? Yes, it did, or no, it didn't. But we know exactly what staff is going to do. And then there are some with a lot of room to shape the program that will affect how it works or whether or not it works. So I just kind of wanted to hone in on that. You talked a little bit about in Oakland, using city-owned land for affordable housing, which is in the housing element, but has a lot of ambiguity. So this is one where just tracking to see whether or not it happened is not going to be enough, right? You're going to be in there working to shape the policy and what that looks like to make sure it's effective. Can you talk a little bit more about that strategy? You mentioned relationships. I know that's part of it. How are you thinking about that type of work where there's ambiguity and something that's really important to you?
Great, thank you, and great question. So there's a long history on this that started with a bunch of activism around the city violating the Surplus Land Act a number of years ago when they were disposing of what's known as the East 12th Street parcel. And one of the things that came out of that was the development of a city land disposition policy, a public land policy. And we got to the point that at the end of 2018, the city council adopted a policy framework, and it was quite extensive about prioritizing land for affordable housing, about having a public review process for that, and for also having a process to look at other uses of public land if no affordable housing proposal came forward. And there was direction to staff to develop an ordinance to actually put that policy framework in work, and it didn't happen. And we've been pushing on it since, and we've been working with a few city council members. There was a whole coalition of groups in Oakland that we were part of to continue to push on this. It still hadn't happened. We're at the point of actually drafting the ordinance ourselves since it's clear that the city staff aren't going to do it. We're working with city council members to actually sponsor and introduce that. But the city put something into the housing element about public land, which frankly didn't really acknowledge the policy framework that they adopted in 2018. And in particular, what really galled us was the policy framework had said if they dispose of city land, 100% of the proceeds that they generate from selling city land would go into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to fund the development of affordable housing. And that's going to be really important because we can't even develop affordable housing on all the city-owned parcels without also having additional resources. So if there are parcels that end up being developed for market rate housing, we want those land sale proceeds going into the fund. And what they put in the housing element was the city will consider putting the proceeds in. And we called them on it at the time. We weren't successful in getting it changed, but we did get a commitment that that was an issue that they are going to revisit, that they may amend the housing element. And we are working with a couple of city council members for whom this is a really big issue to really press for getting something agendized to revisit that policy and to flesh it out and to actually adopt the ordinance that we want. It's going to take a while and a lot of work. But we have a couple of key folks on the city council for whom this is a really important issue, and we are working with them on trying to get that ordinance agendized and introduced.
Awesome. So it sounds like relationships with staff was really important. You're meeting with staff, identifying allies on council, meeting with them, making sure they know what's at stake and what previous commitments were, what it would take to make the policy work. It can be challenging in some cities to know what staff are working on at any given moment. Sometimes it's hard to see what's happening until it comes to council. It kind of emerges on an agenda. So having those relationships and being proactive about the things that you care about, making sure that staff know that that they need to keep you apprised of what's happening and where to plug in is really important. So how important is, we've spent a lot of time as housing advocates talking about the housing element as a thing, a process, a whole bunch of commitments. How important is it now to kind of hone in on policies, the things that are going to be most specific? And I saw that we have a question. How do we choose those things that we think are going to be most impactful that we're going to focus on?
Good question. And I think the answer to that will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So if you put a lot of energy into getting particular programs into the housing element, particularly new things that the city wasn't previously doing, I think it's really important to focus on those and make sure that you get movement on them, because there's a lot of inertia in city government. They'll keep doing the things they've been doing. But you really want to make sure if they said we're going to do this study or we're going to make these zoning changes or whatever, that's happening. The housing element should at least identify the department that is responsible for carrying out those actions. You can then follow up to find out who's actually assigned to be working on that and reach out to them and find out what's going on. So just in terms of which things were a priority for you in your advocacy for the housing element to begin with, which things are going to be big game changers, and we always approach this with the 3 Ps approach. So we're looking at policies around production of housing. We're looking at policies around preservation of existing housing that's affordable, either through deed restriction or just through the market. And we're looking at tenant protection measures. Some stuff is pretty marginal in the housing element. We'll keep doing this. We'll make small adjustments. Some things would be game changers if they happen. We will adopt this new policy. I think that's where we would put our focus, is on the things that are likely to have the most impact. And we also want to look at politically, do we have allies in the community or on the city council that we can work with to really move these things forward? And so, it's a combination for us, I think, of what's going to have the biggest impact and where do we think we have enough political effectiveness to actually get this passed and shape the way in which it does get adopted. But as I say, it's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It depends on your own local conditions.
Okay, that's awesome. I see a comment that it's a lot of detail and a lot of work. Not everyone has the expertise or the time to stay plugged in. How do we get effective focus? I think that for a lot of grassroots organizations, you've been working on this. You know what is most important in your community, what the people in your community care about, and what your community's unique needs are. So, I would allow that to guide the policies that you choose to. There's a question if there are going to be regional folks working to support the tracking. And the answer to that is absolutely. So we know that MTC has plans to do some tracking. We will certainly be tracking in Santa Clara County. We recognize that there's a lot of opportunity to make sure that folks are aware of what other people are doing, so that we can not have so much overlap that our work is ineffective. But we will also, acknowledging we may have different priorities. There may be some groups to whom there's a specific policy that's really important, where we may be focused on something that's a little different, and that's okay. There's absolutely space for that. I don't think this is something where there's one right answer. So kind of one last question, and this is a big one. We're running short on time, but just throw you a big one here. You mentioned Topa Copa. It's a policy with a lot of powerful opposition. Had a very disappointing outcome here in San Jose recently, where we've been working for years to try to get, with deep community engagement, to try to get this across the line. But there's a lot of powerful opposition to it. We've seen it get bogged down in its complexity and the target date in some cities that are considering this as way out there. So how do you keep the momentum and frame a campaign without being constrained by the city's timeline when you have such a long timeline ahead of you?
Well, first, I think those timelines are, we will do this by this date. You can push for them to get it done sooner. We've seen jurisdictions where they said, yes, we said that, but that doesn't constrain us from doing it sooner. So continue to push. If this is a serious priority, if you think you've got the political leverage to really move that policy, then you can push for them to get started on it sooner. Also, the date that you're going to see in there is the date that they're going to bring the product to the city council. It might take a couple of years of work to get there. So you want to be focusing on, are you hiring an outside consultant to do a study, which is likely to happen on a lot of policies? What's the consultant selection process going to look like? When are you going to go out and solicit those proposals, and follow this through step by step so that you don't get to 2026 and go, hey, you promised that you do this policy, by 2026, and here we are, and you haven't even started. So you want to really back up and look at, when should they be getting started in order to meet that deadline or come in earlier than that. So yeah, some of that stuff's pushed out pretty far, but I think there's ways to push for it to happen sooner.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're looking at kind of winding down now. So just a few more things to let you know. So for our call to action today, we're inviting you to visit SV at Home's Housing Element Toolkit. So there you'll find links to the housing elements for each jurisdiction in Santa Clara County, as well as a lot of helpful tools, resources, and information, including how to contact the HCD reviewer for each city. We do update the toolkit regularly, and this is a great place where we will continue to share new information and resources. So right now, only 4 of our Santa Clara County jurisdictions have certified housing elements. So there's still time to advocate for getting the best possible plans. As these elements are firming up, though, take a look at your housing element and begin to identify just a handful of programs that are a priority for you. And how you're thinking forward about the work that you'll need to do to shape them. All the work we've done to get our key policy priorities into the housing element is just the beginning, and we can take these programs from paper to reality if we continue to engage and make it happen. So I am going to hand it over now to Kenneth, our program manager, to wrap us up. Thank you, Kenneth. And thank you so much.
Alison. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Allison. Again, hi, everyone. My name is Kenneth Javier Rosales, and I'm the program manager of SV at Home. Really excited to announce our next PIA on Friday, August 25th at 12 p.m., where we will cover the topic of community-based, community-led development. So keep an eye out, keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending a link to RSVP very soon. So again, stay tuned, keep an eye out on your email. We have a quick 3-question poll. I think it went up just now to get